Hey, this is Dave with Taboo Customs. Today in this video we're going to be going through the removal of the Dana 30 from this 95 Cherokee here. This is in preparation for our 1-ton axle swap in this Jeep, so before we get started on the suspension and the new axle, we're going to have to get this out. So we'll do a pretty complete video here covering everything that you've got to do to remove your Dana 30 from the front of your Cherokee. Alright, so we've obviously pulled the tires off, we've supported the Jeep, and one thing you can't see that we have already removed, and that's going to be the front drive shaft. Since we've already pulled the transfer case for our Dana 300 swap, we've also removed the front drive shaft. Now typically the front drive shaft is not too much of an issue. For the front axle, stock, you're going to have strap style yokes, so you'll have typically an 8mm bolt in those, or 8mm sockets. You'll need to remove the bolts that are in those, and you can just use a screwdriver to hold the yoke, with the transfer case in neutral, and that way you can rotate that drive shaft to get those bolts in easy to access places, because if they're on top, you can have trouble trying to get your socket in there. So the next thing we're going to check is we're going to actually go through a lot of the different bolts, and we are going to lubricate them and clean them up with a wire brush. Now the reason we're going to do that is that on suspensions, a lot of times these bolts get stuck, and there's definitely some bolts that in the Cherokees are an issue, and I'll point some of those out as we go along. But as I mentioned, the first thing we're going to do, go around, clean up all the bolts, clean up all the threads, put some WD-40 on them, get some lubrication on them, and hopefully make sure that everything will come apart easier. Alright, so we've gone through, we've lubricated all the bolts that we think we're going to need to lubricate and remove, and so now we can start removing items. One thing that you're going to want to check though before you start going crazy and unbolting stuff is check to see if your coil springs are still under compression. If they're still under compression, that means that something is keeping that spring held up. So you just don't want to just start unbolting stuff and then finding what is actually holding this spring up, and then it's going to let loose. So before we get to that point though, we're actually going to start by removing the brake lines. That way we can let them drain and get them out of the way, and we're not having stuff drip on us hopefully while we're trying to get under there. So you have a couple of options when removing your brake lines. You can obviously remove them from the point up here where the hard line meets the flexible line, or you can remove them from the caliper. Right now we're going to go ahead and just remove them from the caliper. A lot of times that is easier to do than to remove them from this fitting up here, because depending on the condition of your hard line, these fittings can be kind of a pain in the butt. And if you are going to go for this fitting up here, I'd really suggest a line wrench, and that's basically, it looks like a box end wrench, but it's not completely closed. It's made just to fit over that line, and it's typically 6-point, because these will have a habit of getting kind of seized up, and then you will round that fitting off. You don't want to do that. But for us, like I said, we're going to remove it from the caliper down here. Now for these caliper bolts, we've really seen them all sorts of different sizes, and I kind of expected these to be metric here, but they aren't metric this time. They're actually 9/16. So we'll work on getting those out and getting the calipers drained. Now if you did remove the bolt from the caliper, and this is a banjo type bolt, which they use in the calipers to get flow through the bolts, you will have 2 washers that you have to make sure you don't lose if you're going to end up reusing this. A lot of times I would suggest using new copper washers in there, but we have reused the old ones without issue. As long as you don't have a leak, then you should be good. So keep those two washers, just thread the bolt back in there, and we'll go ahead and let this drain. We're also going to pull the cap off of the brake reservoir so that we can just get some better flow through there so it'll drain out faster. Now we need to do the other side. So for the next step here, what we've done is we've gone in, we've taken some pressure off of the coil spring here, so now the pressure is actually down on our jack. So we've jacked it up a little bit, and we've made sure that the shock is not bottomed out. So the shock, both ends can be a pain in the butt. We'll start with the bottomed end here, and with these bolts on this Jeep are half-inch wrenches, and you'll usually have to use a long extension, a deep well socket. You can get underneath. Make sure you don't put your jack in the way, because I had it in the way a minute ago. Hold the top of the bolt. You can get to it. And we've had these bolts a lot of times be stuck and break off because nobody's had them out and ever. So. Alright, so we'll move up top and we'll take a look at that nut, because that one can actually be the one that causes you the most issues a lot of times, and they're typically the hardest to get to as well. So the top nut on the shocks, we'll take a look at the driver's side here first. You can see that the driver's side here is kind of buried down underneath the master cylinder. We've also got an additional transmission cooler here to contend with. You wouldn't have this here in most Jeeps, but we'll have to contend with that as we try to take that nut off. On the passenger side, it's basically buried between the washer fluid and the engine coolant bottle here. And it's a little bit easier to get to because it's a straight shot down and you can get a longer extension. Now on these shocks here, and like I said, the bolts can vary on the shocks, especially this shock is actually used as a 17mm socket, so we'll see how those come loose, and hopefully they come loose easily. Okay, so that went a whole lot easier than we expected it to. What often happens with these nuts here is that they get somewhat seized up on the shaft here, and when they do, this whole shock will start spinning on you. Now you can sometimes get them by going down and putting a vice grip here, but a lot of times it's really difficult, and there's a good chance that you snap off the stud on the top of this shock. And worst case scenario, we've had a couple we actually had to go in and cut just because we couldn't get them, and we ended up stripping out the nut trying to get it to break. But let's take a look at the driver's side, since we know we're going to have a little bit more challenge with that. Alright, so the driver's side, and one thing I didn't say over there on the passenger side is that with my other hand I'm actually holding the shock underneath the Jeep to keep it from rotating, because I found that I can get an end wrench down in here and I get a little bit of space to at least get some turns on this nut. And if you just turn this nut, well, the nut's actually pretty loose. If you turn the nut, a lot of times the shock will turn with the nut, so you got to hold the shock, and in some cases you may have to get a pipe wrench or something else to really hold onto that shock, and that's what can make it kind of difficult. You're trying to hold the shock while you're turning the nut on top, and if it's seized up, it can be a real pain. But if it's not seized up, well, like this, it goes pretty easily. Which we didn't expect. Alright, so chances are this means something else in this project is going to be harder on us, since this went so well. Now that we have our shock out, and one thing we noticed in this Jeep while we were pulling the shocks off is that we actually don't have a sway bar. And a lot of times beyond the shocks, the sway bar is also going to be what might keep some compression on these springs, or really keep it from dropping very far. And we don't have a sway bar on this Jeep because this was mainly an off-road Jeep and the customer had already taken the sway bar off. So to remove the sway bar, you'll typically have a link that mounts right up here in front of the spring that you'll want to pull off. It's usually not too much of a problem. You may have to take a hammer and knock the bushings off of the sway bar link, because they can be sometimes a pain. And then if you want to completely remove the sway bar, you've got a couple of bolts that go up in the bottom of the unibody up here, and they typically aren't too much of an issue either. So now that we've got our shock out of the way and the sway bar is already gone, we can see that our spring doesn't have any compression on it anymore. So it's now safe to work a little bit more on the spring and actually get this apart. What we'll do next is we'll undo the spring retainer here. Then we'll support the axle so that we can start unbolting the rest of the items that we need to. So for the spring retainer, it's it looks like it's a 13mm socket here for the bolt, and with the shock out of the way, it's a lot easier to get to, and typically they'll come off pretty easily. Now you don't need to unbolt this all the way. You should just have to unbolt it a little ways, and then you can probably turn it sideways and it'll give you the clearance. Now you can try pressing down on the axle and pulling the spring out now if you wanted, but it can be a little bit more of a pain, especially if you've got a stock lower control arms, because they typically will hit on the back here of this bracket. And for us, we're going to wait a little bit before we go and pull those out. The next couple of steps we're going to work on is we're going to work on pulling out the drag link for the steering here, and then we're going to go ahead and work on pulling the track bar mount. So for the next step, we're going to pull the drag link off the pitman arm. Again, this can be another one of those things that can go smoothly or be a pain in the butt. Chances are it'll be a pain in the butt, but we'll see. First, we got to pull the cotter pin out, which you'll need a pair of needle nose more than likely to get that cotter pin out. And with the cotter pin out, this should be a 3/4 inch socket. Okay, so now that we've got the castle nut off the top, the next is to try to separate the drag link from the pitman arm. And for this, you can try taking a hammer, hitting the drag link here to pop it out. You can use a pickle fork in here. You're going to tear up the boot when you do that, so just expect that. Or you can do what we're about to show you in a moment, and that's use a long piece of tube coming down and basically trying to get hit as close to this joint as you can, and hopefully we can pop it loose. A lot of times it will, but we'll have to see how it goes. So what we've done is we've slid, and it's actually an old axle shaft here that we cut apart. We slid this axle shaft down, trying to get it as straight up and down as possible with the drag link on the bottom, and then we've rested it against the drag link. So we'll be able to hit this from the top to try to knock that drag link loose from the bottom. Okay, well, as you saw, the first method for getting the end out didn't work so well. So we're on to our second method, which is a pickle fork and a big hammer. Now, of course, in this method, we are going to destroy the boot, which we aren't reusing this drag link anyway, so it's not a huge issue. Now for the next step, we will be removing our control arm here, or excuse me, not the control arm, but the track bar. To do that, pretty similar to the drag link here. We've got a cotter pin, a castle nut, probably feels like it might be the same size, maybe a little bit smaller. So we'll take that off, and you'll have to do the same thing, pickle fork in here. So let's get started on that. Now one thing you can do, and we probably should have done it for this drag link, is you can leave the nut still threaded on the top there, so when it does break loose, it doesn't completely drop and whack you in the knee or something. I always recommend putting the nuts and the bolts back wherever you take them out of. If you don't, if you're like me, you're going to lose half of them. Alright, so the only thing left right now for this axle is actually the springs and the control arm. So that'd be the next step in this process, is start to take those out and dropping the axle down. Alright, so the next step, and the only things we've really got connected now are both upper control arms, the lower control arms, and we've still got the springs in here. So we've lowered the axle, set it back on the jack stands, but we have the springs to where they're loose so that we can start disconnecting the control arms. Now this Jeep's quite a ways up in the air, so the axle's quite a ways off the ground still. So what we're going to do is we're going to disconnect the control arms here at the axle on the top, the uppers, and then we're actually going to go ahead and let the axle down, and we're going to disconnect the control arms on the rear at the frame. Now you can also take them off here at the axle, and if we were just swapping axles, that's what we would do, but since we are replacing the whole suspension on this Jeep, we're just going to remove them from the frame at the lower control arms. So the upper control arm mounts, they've got bolts in them that have a little plate that is supposed to catch on this back, but I can already see on this one that this plate is turned, and so it's all splayed out. So chances are that that plate will just turn whenever we loosen it up, or not. Oh yeah, see, so now the plate is just spinning. So what we've done, we've grabbed some vice grips, caught there, and we're going to grab that. Alright, so now we will show you the other side. The other side is a little bit different. This little plate that's on the bolt actually came off, so we're going to have to try to grab a hold of that bolt. Now it is it does have a somewhat standard head on it, but sometimes when that plate comes off of there, it can mess that head up. So I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get a good wrench on it or not. You can see here's where that plate is supposed to be at, that catches on the edge of the control arm, and it's gone. Now our 15mm wrench somewhat fits on it, but I can feel that it might not be great if this bolt doesn't want to come loose. I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but this is a 15mm nut, and the good news is it looks like it did come loose. I mean, options if this hadn't worked, one of the things we've done in the past is clean this bolt, or excuse me, clean the head of this bolt up, weld a new nut on top of it, something that we can really grab onto. Or you could just cut the head of it off with a hard wheel, knock the bolt out. But we lucked out in both cases. Both bolts came out clean. Now with this one, because this is the third control arm, it's really what's holding the axle upright. So I'm going to get out from under it, get a longer punch before I knock this bolt out, because I don't want this axle moving on me. I mean, there's no compression on the springs, so the worst case is the axle weight would actually be what would fall. So let's go. Now as I knock it out, I can see the axle wants to rotate forward, so we're going to grab a just a quick strap and put it from here to the frame just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Alright, now we're going to let the axle down so we can work on the lower control arms. Of course, we always forget one thing. That's the vent hose. Alright, time to work on the lower control arm mounts. Okay, so we've removed the upper control arms just so you guys can see in here a little bit clearer. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the lower control arms. For the Dana 30 axle, some of them will have, now if you're removing it from the axle end, some of them will have cam washers to change the camber of the axle. If it has that, make sure you mark where that's at before you remove that so you can try to put it back in the same place. On these, they also some have slotted holes, so you want to make sure you kind of mark where it's at before you go removing it. Now these bolts, both the upper mount and the lower mount, are the same size heads. They're 21 millimeter sockets, so we got our 21 millimeter. Now normally I'd want to put the impact on the inside and try to take the nut off instead of doing it from the outside here. That way the only thing you're fighting is the nut, at least from the start. However, this Jeep actually had a full skid plate set under it, and that's what this bracket here is for. Your normal Cherokees won't have this bracket in it, but we do, so we have to contend with it. Now I'm trying just to take the nut off. I'm not trying to take the bolt out because I don't want the axle to fall on me. Oh, so far so good. We'll try to get the other side now. Alright, well that all went pretty easily. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and I'm going to get out from under it. And I'm going to pull the bolts out. Now a trick to pulling these bolts out is, and you can use the 21 millimeter end wrench, but if you can get the end wrench underneath the head of the bolt so that you can use the wrench to actually pull the bolt out as you're doing the impact, it'll pull the it'll help pull that bolt out. So that should do it. Let's see if we can get her pulled out. That does it for this video on how to remove the front Dana 30 from your Jeep Cherokee. If you have any questions or comments, if you want to take a look at our products, feel free to visit us at taboocustoms.com. Thanks for watching.